He stood on the precipice of annihilation, surrounded by rings of scarlet like interlocking chains of violence painted upon the snow. Stand witness to the fall of the Snow Prince. Monstrous men and women came upon the Falmer, those whose voices cracked the sky and whose hands trained in naught but the ways of bloodletting. The Snow Prince, bathed in glamours, shelled in an alabaster panoply as glory befits, fought upon the slopes of the Moesring and bore witness to his final moments. The Northmen shouted their violence, and baritones sundered the Falmer paladins, rendering them to heaps of red flesh and shattered moonstone. The Snow Prince fought on, cold spear in hand, atop a glorious steed, paladin pure. Glory to Auri-El! King Auri-El! Suddenly, something was wrong. His spear slipped from his hands, and from his steed he fell. His mouth dripped a veil of crimson, and a sword lay buried in his side. A girl, a mere lass of 12 years, had felled the Snow Prince in vengeance, for her mother was slain by his hand only moments ago. And so it was that the days of the Falmer, the Snow Elves, were truly over. The Battle of the Moesring was the final stand of the Falmer, or at least this is the epic last stand that is most remembered. The true destruction of the Snow Elves took many centuries more, their future only becoming darker each day. Darker in the truest sense. While the dating for the fall of the Snow Prince occurred centuries before, it was in the 139th year of the First Era that the not yet King Harold set out to remove the last of the Snow Elves from Skyrim, from the journal of Skorm Snowstrider, year 139. At the command of Lord Harold, we have swept our company to the south edge of our territories in an attempt to drive the Snow Elves up north to the main host of his forces. The first few days met with heavy resistance, but as we approached the eastern edge of Lake Honric, we have seen little and less of them. By the earliest centuries of the First Era, that is well over 4,000 years before the date of the events of the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, the Snow Elves have all but vanished. In all likelihood, several would have sought refuge among the neighbouring Dureni, Kaima, or Aelids, their distinct blood lost in integration. However, it was the Dwemer, those deep elves of the underground, who provided safe harbour, though safe harbour is a funny way of putting it.
We had always maintained an uneasy alliance with the underground-dwelling dwarves, and when faced with extinction, we turned to them for help. Surprisingly, they agreed to protect us, but demanded a terrible price: the blinding of our race.
The Falmer are one of the most interesting foes you can face in Skyrim, their history intimately connected with the land, their past glories largely a mystery to us who only witness them as the degenerated chitin-clad tribes of savages who for thousands of years have been the boogeymen of Nordic tales and superstition. The Snow Elves have been blamed for all kinds of misfortunes and woes throughout the millennia. When a child goes missing, kidnapped by the Elves was the likely explanation. When a crop fails, Snow Elf magic was the likely explanation. Surely, most incidents fall within the realm of superstition. However, as an enterprising adventurer might discover, these superstitions are not without basis in reality. The terms Snow Elves and Falmer are technically interchangeable. They mean the same thing, in a similar way that High Elves and Altmora, or Wood Elves and Bosmer, are interchangeable terms. However, Falmer has come to more specifically reference the degenerated troglodytes that inhabit the subterranean depths of Skyrim, whereas the term Snow Elves has been used in more specific reference to the pre-Deformation elves who once ruled Skyrim. I will also maintain this distinction for the rest of the video for ease.
I prefer Snow Elf. The name Falmer usually holds a negative meaning to most travelers. Those twisted creatures you call Falmer, I call the betrayed.
The reality of the Falmer today is that they are blind, hunched, deformed elves, a transformation that no doubt was not immediate, but has been the result of both forced mutation and, in all likelihood, evolutionary adaptations favoring those with keen senses of the ears and nose. How the Falmer see is not fully understood either, considering their absence of eyes. Theories would include a developed echolocation sense, seeing as some bats or dolphins can. Their ears have certainly developed in size and length, which would hint at such an ability. Their noses too have flattened, and the nostrils are longer and more exposed, which perhaps suggests a more developed sense of smell. The combination of these two senses would certainly provide them with the ability to navigate with ease, but we also see them fire bows and shoot spells. Surely such aiming would be complicated without sight. I suppose some form of magical sight or enhanced echolocation through magic is possible. I'm no expert in echolocation, and with my sight intact, and without echolocation myself, it is hard to truly conceptualize how hard or easy it may really be. Unfortunately, we haven't encountered any Falmer that A, can speak the common tongue, and B, is not hostile to outsiders, so it's not like we can really ask for clarification. Using Occam's razor, the simplest explanation is that they have developed echolocation and an advanced sense of smell over thousands of years of subterranean existence. We will dive into the theories regarding the why, what, when, how their current state has been attained later in the video, but I think such discussion is better rooted in historical context so that we can perhaps glean hints such as the rate of transformation and perhaps what magical or alchemical substances were used to assist it. 2. Any discussion of their modern day culture and religion will make more sense in light of their historical roots. The Falmer are weirder than you think, but to truly get a good grasp on the Falmer, we need to go back to their days as snow elves, and perhaps even beyond. We shall ride the great dragon through the rivers of time and land ourselves at the dawn. We should note that we delve into a time more mythical and contradictory, its only record in tales and metaphors, its recounting coloured by the cultural attitudes of its keepers. So as with anything regarding the creation of Mundus, take all with a grain of salt. Hold these ideas loosely. The annotated Annuad provides one of the explanations for how the world came to be. It's the main source that recounts what happened to Old Elnefey, otherwise known as Old Meris. Old Elnefey was sundered in a war between the precursors of elves and men, and the face of Mundus was reshaped. All that remained of Old Elnefey was Tamriel. This is one explanation for Old Meris. However, keep in mind that there is potentially some far-off Old Meris land that we no longer can locate. Some speculate that Pyandania is the sunken remnants of that land. Anyways, during the Sundering, the Aldmer were lost in a storm and eventually found Somerset, which would be their new home. Certain pioneers, like Topal the Pilot, set out on the seas to find Old Meris, but instead he had found Tamriel, which, according to the annotated Annuad, is the remnants of Old Elnefey reshaped in the Sundering. The reason I bring all this up is that in order to understand the Snow Elves' place in the world, we need to get a grasp of lineage. The classical Altmeri perspectives claim that all the Elves of Tamriel descended from the Aldmer, with the Altmer, the High Elves, being the purest existing form. This is certainly true for the Dureni, Aelids, and the Chimer, who throughout the Merethic era venture to High Rock, Cyrodiil, and Morrowind respectively. The Dwemer origin I feel is most likely some offshoot of the early Chimer society, perhaps during the High Velothi culture era, though there are other proposed origins for them as well. Bosmer origin is suggested to be from the same Somerset Aldmer roots, however, there are also many contradictions regarding their nascence, and there are sources that imply they were given stable forms by Ifri, moulded from the primordial ooze. This is also corroborated by Khajiit mythology, which states that Azura moulded the Khajiit from elven stock, which must have predated the Aldmer of Somerset, considering that Topal the Pilot saw Khajiit in his circumnavigation of Tamriel. It's always important to remember that the Elder Scrolls is an amalgamation of unreliable narrators with no definitive authoritative source. The best authority lore we have is that which is directly experienced within the games, but this does not apply to the wealth of mythology and early histories that we only have accounts of, and so we must always reserve room for alternative explanations. In this particular case, with all the evidence pulled together, we have explanations for the appearance of most of the elven races, but the Snow Elves are one glaring exception. One plausible explanation is that they're just another offshoot of Aldmer expansion in the early Merethic era, similar similar to the Ayleids or the Dureni. However, I will say I think this explanation may be a little bare. The Altmor, as precursors to the elven races of the Ayleids, Altmor, Chimera, and Dureni, visually makes a lot of sense. There may be subtle variations in skin tones between these distinct cultures, but for the most part they have skins with golden hues, elven height, and magical prowess, whereas the Snow Elves are pallid, hair and skin of pure white, a stark difference from these other elven races, so it doesn't feel as if, to me, they were just an offshoot of the Altmor of Somerset in the same way the Dureni or the Ayleids were. I will say though that these elves, aside from the heretic Chimera, all place Auri-El in a position of highest regard, and they share much of the same pantheon, though the Ayleids began adding Daedra in time. Through the words of one of the last living Snow Elves, Knight-Paladin Gelebor, we hear that the Snow Elves too held Auri-El in much esteem. In reference to the Chantry of the Forgotten Vale, he says,
"This is, or was, the epicenter of our religion. Most of the Snow Elf people worshipped Auri-El."
In the book Varieties of Faith, it says this about Auri-El. Auri-El, King of the Altmor. The elven Akatosh is Auri-El. Auri-El is the soul of Anu-El, who in turn is the soul of Anu, the Everything. He is the chief of most Altmeri pantheons. Most Altmeri and Bosmeri claim direct descent from Auri-El. In his only known moment of weakness, he agreed to take part in the creation of the mortal plane, that act which forever sundered the elves from the spirit worlds of eternity. To make up for it, Auri-El led the original Altmor against the armies of Lorkhan in mythic times, vanquishing that tyrant and establishing the first kingdoms of the Altmor, Altmora, and Old Elnefey. He then ascended to heaven in full observance of his followers so that they might learn the steps needed to escape the mortal plane. Altmora and Old Elnefey. Altmora, not Atmora. No doubt you have heard the term Atmora, the frozen fatherland of the Nords from which Ysgramor sailed in the Return. Well, in Old Meris, the language of the Aldmer, not the place, this land is called Altmora, which means Elder Wood. This speaks of an elven kingdom called Altmora, which is interesting. In the book The Monomyth, in the Altmeri, the Heart of the World section, it says this: Auri-El could not save Altmora, the Elderwood, and it was lost to men. They were chased south and east to Old Elnefey, and Lorkhan was close behind. He shattered that land into many. Finally, Trinimac, Auri-El's greatest knight, knocked Lorkhan down in front of his army and reached in with more than hands to take his heart. He was undone. The men dragged Lorkhan's body away and swore blood vengeance on the heirs of Auri-El for all time. One of the most difficult things about this whole Auri-El vs Lorkhan Old Elnefey business is that different sources seem to give different sequences of events. For example, the Varieties of Faith book we just spoke about prior implies that Auri-El led the Altmor against Lorkhan and his armies of men, vanquishing him, and then established the kingdoms of Altmora and Old Elnefey, whereas the Monomyth outlines an order of events in which the kingdom of Altmora was lost during the wars with Lorkhan, and Old Elnefey was shattered into many as a result of the war. I will say that the Monomyth version of events makes more sense to me, but earlier in the Monomyth text it references the exodus of the Chimera as already having happened, which doesn't really make sense because the Somerset Isles were where the exodus occurred from, but the Isles didn't exist yet because Old Elnefey, or Old Meris, had not been sundered yet, becoming Tamriel. It's a bit of a mess, but I'm going to just try and throw out a possible explanation for the Snow Elves' origins and perhaps also some reasoning as to why they would appear different and have no described connection to Somerset. I think that the Snow Elves were the rulers of the elven kingdom Altmora, the cold frozen north. If we are looking at lineage, we would have the Altmor of Old Elnefey first, that is, the not yet sundered lands of Tamriel. What if the very earliest offshoots of the Altmor were the Falmer, who went north to found Altmora, the elven kingdom of the Elder Wood, and perhaps even the Maormer of Pyendanea are such offshoots of a similar time. Then in sequence we have the big war between Auri-El and the Elves and Lorkhan and men, and as the Monomyth states, Auri-El could not save Altmora, the Elderwood, and it was lost to men. They were chased south and east to Old Elnefey, and Lorkhan was close behind. He shattered that land into many. So then the Snow Elves of Altmora were chased south and east to Old Elnefey, and Lorkhan followed. Then Old Elnefey was shattered, land sunk beneath the seas, and the remnants of that land became Tamriel. Naturally, the Snow Elves coming from the north to Old Elnefey would have at first been in the northern portions of Tamriel. Perhaps what is today the lands of Skyrim. Perhaps in these more mountainous regions, when the Sundering occurred, the refugees of Altmora survived here, whereas the Aldmar had fled to the seas, only to be lost in the storms and to rediscover what was left of their home, yet they did not know it. Then, of course, they spread from Somerset to become the Aelids, Doreni, and so on. I think this suggested sequence of events both gives context for this elven kingdom of Altmora and explains why the Snow Elves of Skyrim are so distinct from the other neighbouring elves at the time. This is all pure theory crafting fun, but it's unfortunate that all of this is so deeply entrenched in mythological hearsay and contradictory narratives. If we were to take a step out of the realm of conjecture and into the concrete, the earliest real historical evidence regarding the Snow Elves are the stories of their destruction. Even the Chantry of Auri-El, a hidden sanctuary in the Forgotten Vale high within the Druidark Mountains, was by Gelebor's account built near the beginning of the First Era, which is well after Nordic arrival.
The Chantry was constructed near the beginning of the First Era to provide a retreat for those that wish to become enlightened.
Knight-Paladin Gelebor is perhaps the best source on the Snow Elves, considering he is the only one still living who is not a vampire or a degenerated troglodyte.
We were once a wealthy and prosperous society that occupied a portion of Skyrim. Unfortunately, we were constantly at war with the Nords, who claimed the land as their ancestral home.
It appears the Nords won.
In a manner of speaking. We had always maintained an uneasy alliance with the underground-dwelling dwarves, and when faced with extinction, we turned to them for help. Surprisingly, they agreed to protect us, but demanded a terrible price: the blinding of our race.
Everyone couldn't have possibly agreed to that.
There were splinter groups that resisted the agreement, and even some that sought alternate alliances. But when it was all said and done, those elves were either slaughtered, vanished, or gave up and took the dwarves' bargain.
What turned your people into the betrayed?
I've often asked myself that very same question. The blinding of my race was supposedly accomplished with a toxin, certainly not enough to devolve them into the sad and twisted beings they've become.
Why weren't the Snow Elves here affected?
The Chantry is quite isolated, so it took some time for word of the dwarves' offer to reach us here. By the time the compact had been completed, it was too late for us to even attempt to intervene.
Is that why you had retained your sight?
Correct. We only numbered perhaps 100 at the time, so our presence remained a secret to the dwarves and the Nords. Ironically, our undoing came at the hands of our own people.
You mean the betrayed?
Yes. They swarmed the Chantry in vast numbers until we were completely overrun. We never really stood a chance. I assumed that the Archcurate was corrupted by them when they found a way to breach the inner sanctum.
There are others here like you?
Wuuthrad and myself are the only two Snow Elves that remain.
Gelebor and Vyther, as well as the fate of the Chantry of Auri-El, are invaluable evidence in our research, so perhaps in order to provide better context, we should try and determine some dates. For starters, by Gelebor's own account, the Chantry of Auri-El was constructed near the beginning of the First Era, which means it would be something in the ballpark of 4,450 to 4,440 years old. Remember that year 139 of the First Era is the date when the last of the Snow Elves were pushed from Skyrim by Nordic armies, so with that said, we know Gelebor must have initially been born and lived in this roughly 140-year period and would have become a Knight-Paladin of the Chantry. In the context of Gelebor's dialogue, he describes the blinding of his race and the agreement with the Dwemer as having occurred during his lifetime and initial tenure at the Chantry before its eventual collapse. So given that, if I was to give an educated guess, I would think that the desperation of the Snow Elves and their deal with the Dwemer would have occurred in the final years of their existence in Skyrim, before year 139. So I'd guess that the initial blinding of the Snow Elves and the safe harbor provided in return happened anywhere between year year 130 and 139. I just think that those years would have represented the peak desperation for their people. After all, willingly accepting blindness in return for safety is a truly desperate move. Though we do have historical record predating this time in history, details of occurrences during the days of the late Merethic era.
We were once a wealthy and prosperous society that occupied a portion of Skyrim. Unfortunately, we were constantly at war with the Nords, who claimed the land as their ancestral home.
This may just be my inference, but Gelebor's words, constantly at war with the Nords, seems to imply some level of prolonged conflict, and in light of the context of Saarthal, which we are about to discuss, it would seem that there were several centuries of fighting. Enter Ysgramor. Ysgramor, the harbinger of the Nords, is arguably the most important figure amongst the Nords. According to a line from Kodlak, the current harbinger of the Companions during the events of the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim,
"The Companions are nearly 5,000 years old."
Which, if taken at face value, places Ysgramor and his 500 companions roughly around ME 500. Dating for the Merethic era works like BC dating for us. It counts backwards, so this is 500 years before the First Era. As we discussed in the Forsworn video previously, there is contention to be had with the Out of Atmora theory, which states that all races of men originally hail from Atmora, with one of its main sources being the book Before the Ages of Man, which gives the dating for the first human, not necessarily Nordic, settlement between ME 1000 and ME 800, so Ysgramor's timing of ME 500 falls within these parameters. We must also consider that the 5,000 year figure also is referencing the Companions, meaning when Ysgramor returned to have vengeance on the Snow Elves, meaning Saarthal would have been built sometime before this. I'm willing to take this dating to be truth, especially when considering that between the time of Ysgramor and the First Era, we need to see the expansion of the Nords, the rise of the Dragon Cult, Alduin's tyranny, and then the fall of the Dragon Cult during the Dragon Wars, all which occur before the First Era. When one looks at the ancient Nordic ruins, obviously constructed during the time of the Dragon Cult, given their Draga, Dragon Priests, Dragon Walls, and accompanying iconography, then it would seem to me that these 5-ish centuries are needed to provide such expansion and construction. However, it could be to some degree hand-waved with the idea that magic helped them build faster. We could also look at King Harold, who is said to have been the 13th in the line of Ysgramor himself. So, to get a rough insight into dating, we could look at what 13 generations is in time, and we could get a figure between 260 and 520 years, depending on the generational turnover, and also we're talking about a line of kings, not just generations, so we could have long-lived and short-lived kings to mix things up. But for the sake of ease, we could assume between 260 and 520 years. This would give us a date counting back from Harold as a 20-year-old in 1E 133, anywhere between ME 127 and ME 387. Personally, I do find a date of ME 127 to be a little far-fetched, considering it would have to encompass all of Saarthal, Ysgramor and the 500 Companions, the rise of the Dragon Cult, the expansion of the Nordic ruins, and then the Dragon Wars, all occurring in little over a century. Kodlak, with his offhand dating of nearly 5,000 years, could also be off, but to wrap up this nerdy dating stuff, I think an all things considered safe estimation for Ysgramor's return with the 500 Companions could be between ME 500 and ME 200. That's what I think. All of this talk about Ysgramor is very relevant to the Snow Elves because it is he who marks the beginning of their downfall. It's at this time that the Snow Elves actually explicitly come onto the scene in the historical record at the founding of Saarthal. Bear in mind that the following source retains a lot of imperial bias, but the first pocket guide to the Empire says, as recorded in the Songs of Return, Ysgramor and his family first landed in Tamriel at Sarek Head, at the extreme northern tip of Skyrim's Broken Cape, fleeing civil war in Atmora, then rather warmer than at present, as it seems to have supported a substantial population. These first settlers named the land Merith, after the elves that roamed the untamed wilderness, which then covered the whole of Tamriel. For a time, relations between men and elves were harmonious, and the Nords throve in this new land, summoning more of their kin from the north to build the city of Saarthal, the site of which has recently been located by Imperial archaeologists in the vicinity of modern Winterhold. But the elves saw the vital young race would soon surpass their stagnant culture if left unchecked, and fell upon the unsuspecting Nords in the infamous Night of Tears. Saarthal was burned, and only Ysgramor and 2 of his sons fought free of the carnage and escaped to Atmora. The Elves, however, had reckoned with the indomitable spirit of the Nords, gathering his legendary 500 companions, whose names are still recited every 13th of Sun's Dawn at the Feast of the Dead in Windhelm. Ysgramor returned to Tamriel with a vengeance, driving the Elves out of Skyrim and laying the foundations of the First Human Empire. It may be that the exploits of the near-mythical Ysgramor conflate the reigns of several early Nord kings, as the Elves were not finally driven from the present boundaries of Skyrim until the reign of King Harald, the 13th of Ysgramor's line, at the dawn of recorded history. The idea that the Snow Elves slaughtered every single Nord of the city of Saarthal out of fear of the Nord's population expansion is plausible enough, but it does reek of bias and paints the Snow Elves in a terrible light. However, even if there were some better, more noble reason they did essentially genocide a whole city, we in the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim can venture to the archaeological site of Saarthal, an ancient Nordic city near totally submerged in ice, and we can make some discoveries that drastically alter the perception of this event, an event named the Night of Tears. The book of the same name provides some inquiry into the true cause of this terrible event. What happened on that Night of Tears when Saarthal was razed to the ground? What provoked the Elves to such a deliberate, vicious attack, and what prompted such a severe response from the Nords? Vingulmo's treatise on the Ultima Antecedent suggests that the Elves of the Merethic era, along with their counterparts, the early Dwemer, possessed a degree of sophistication unparalleled in Tamriel. They displayed power beyond what could be expected of the time. While a distinct explanation is not given for this, I believe that this work, compared with the early writing of Hesef Charinus, suggests that something greater was at work on that night in Saarthal. The true motives behind the Night of Tears have been obscured to us by the passage of time, but I believe this was not a simple war of territory or of control of Skyrim. I believe that what happened was a significant event based around something very particular. The Nords found something when they built their city, buried deep in the ground. They attempted to keep it buried, but the Elves learned of it and coveted it for themselves. Thus they assaulted Saarthal, their goal not to drive the Nords out but to secure this power for themselves. I believe Ysgramor knew something of what the Elves would find under Saarthal, and rallied together his people to keep the Elves from gaining it. When Nords once again controlled Skyrim, the power was buried deep below the earth and sealed away. The Nords found something, he says. Can you guess what that may be? Well, when you first join the College of Winterhold, you are to take part in an expedition of Saarthal, and with the powers of plot design, you happen upon an entrance previously undiscovered, leading to long hidden passages and chambers, and eventually you come across the most remarkable of artifacts, the Eye of Magnus. This magical artifact becomes the main focus of the College of Winterhold questline, a process which involves acquiring the Staff of Magnus and preventing Ancano, the Thalmor agent, from acquiring such power.
You think I can't destroy you? The power to unmake the world at my fingertips. And you think you can do anything about it?
This quote and the motives of the Sigic Order imply that the Eye of Magnus has a power beyond this world, something to be safeguarded and kept from the hands of those who would abuse it. Could the original Snow Elf slaughter of Saarthal be in fact a desperate attempt to secure the Eye of Magnus from the clever men of the Nords who would have perhaps used its power to lay waste to the elven kingdoms of Tamriel at the time? Was the Night of Tears essentially a desperate attempt to stop the Nords from meddling with powers beyond their understanding? To stop monkeys from playing with nuclear codes? Or was it this discovery that spurned the Snow Elves to make a ploy for the power themselves? Perhaps with such a power, they could return their people to Aetherius, no longer bound by the enfleshed forms of creation. These are all plausible suggestions, but there is no certainty to be had. Though I personally do take the Nords discovering and guarding the Eye of Magnus in Saarthal as the inciting reason for the Night of Tears, a far better and perhaps more plausible reasoning for why the Snow Elves would try and justify a genocidal attack. We must also remember that societies and cultures aren't monoliths, and there could have indeed been many Snow Elves who were motivated to attack under the premise of intolerable Nordic expansion and population growth. But I have a feeling for the most part it would have been a two birds with one stone situation. In the first pocket guide to the Empire, there are annotations by an elven traveller under the name YR. The first annotation is a single exclamation mark at the pocket guide calling the Elves a stagnant culture, but the second annotation links to a note saying, Ysgramor's provocations and blasphemies have of course been long forgotten. In light of what we know about Saarthal and the Eye of Magnus, then perhaps these suggested provocations and blasphemies are regarding the Nords' profane use of the Eye of Magnus, which the Snow Elves felt was their duty to stop. Magnus, for those of you unaware, is the architect of Mundus. While the idea for Mundus was thought up by Lorkhan, it was Magnus who created the schematics and diagrams needed to construct the mortal plane. He is also known as the god of sorcery, as when Lorkhan's betrayal was discovered, Magnus fled, tearing a hole in the firmament, creating the sun, allowing magical energies from Aetherius to flow through, which is why mortals can access magicka and all its possibilities. Magnus is an important deity in most Elven pantheons, and considering the similarities between the Snow Elves pantheon and those of the other elves, we can assume that Magnus was held in high esteem in Snow Elf society, and hence tampering with his very eye would be considered heretical, hence the drastic actions of the Snow Elves in the Night of Tears. The infamous Night of Tears and its exact causes still remain shrouded in mystery, light only shed in speculation and small evidence. What we do know is that this Night of Tears earned a reprisal so devastating, so significant, that it would change the fate of Tamriel and mark the first steps of mankind's dominance of Tamriel. The Return. Every Mer the Harbinger slew at Wuuthrad's bite. All through the long campaign, the only weapon that would fit in the Harbinger's hand was the mighty Wuuthrad. As he told it, the most legendary of axes was forged in the darkest of nights. It was the Night of Tears. Ysgramor sat, staring out across the waters. He rode upon the last ship in his fleet, fleeing Tamriel for the shores of Atmora. From that vantage point, he watched as Saarthal, the first city, burned. A swollen sky poured rain upon the flames and upon the sea, and the greatest of us all wept bitter tears. So great was the grief of the Harbinger that instead of salty sorrow, Ysgramor wept tears of purest ebony. His eldest, Ingol, collected the tears in a stein and held his father in a warm embrace. He poured mead down the Harbinger's great throat, wrapped furs around the Harbinger's great shoulders, and slung the Harbinger into a great hammock below decks. Then he set to work, for Ingol, eldest son to the Harbinger of us all, was the greatest smith our people have ever known. There on the sea, Ingol set to work with his tools. He used lightning to heat the night's tears, the ocean swell to cool them, and always his hammer blows rang in concert with the rising wind. When Ysgramor awoke the next morning, Ingol presented him with a mighty axe, hewn from the sorrow that had laid him low just the night before. And the Harbinger of us all embraced his son. He cried out in joy, sadness, and rage, and there on the deck of the last ship from Saarthal, Ysgramor named his axe Wuuthrad, which means Storm's Tears in the language of Atmora. Ysgramor sung Storm's tears through the flesh of the Falmer, the shrieking face of its head mocking the slain who lay heaped and chopped in red carpets of gore. Ysgramor and his 500 companions amalgamated like a twisted beast of impenetrable shield wall, like a hide, and with axes like jagged teeth, it relentlessly ran down its elven prey. When at last the rightful claim of Saarthal had been retaken, driving the murderous elves back to their lofty cities, did Ysgramor turn and let loose the fearsome war cry that echoed across all the oceans. The 500 who yet stood joined in the ovation for the victory and the lament for their fallen peers. It was said to be heard on the distant and chilling green shores of Atmora, and the ancestors knew their time had come to cross the seas. As the reverberations echoed out and drowned to silence, all looked to Ysgramor, who bore the blessed Wuuthrad, for his next commandment. With his lungs that bellowed forth the fury of humanity, he bade them to continue their march, that the devious Mer might know the terror they had brought on themselves with their trickery. "Go forth!" he roared, "into the belly of this new land. Drive the wretched from their palaces of idleness. Oblige them to squalor and toil, that they would see their betrayals as the all sin against our kind. Give no quarter, show no kindness, for they would not give nor show you the same." From this point, after Saarthal had been retaken from the Snow Elves with no quarter given, the captains and their crews dispersed in all directions, seeking to unroot the elves wherever they hid. Vengeance eternal. A Nordic genocide at Saarthal by the hands of the elves, returned tenfold by the Nords, set to the quest of utter and complete extermination of their kind. The final battle that marks the point of no return for the Snow Elves was the Battle of the Moesring. Moesring, of course, refers to the Moesring Mountains of Solstheim, which, at this time, if we take legends about it at face value, was still connected to the mainland, though the book Fall of the Snow Prince refers to Solstheim as an island. Later, during the reign of the Dragon Cult, there would be a legendary battle between Varlock and Miraak, which supposedly severed Solstheim from the mainland, though bear in mind this could also just as easily be pure storytelling hyperbole. Mentioning that, I would also like to point out that I have often seen the Battle of the Moesring, the epic final stand of the Snow Elves, attributed to a later time, around when King Harold drives out the remaining Snow Elves. This is wrong. I can understand the confusion, as final battle is a bit of a misnomer, as there would be the centuries of continued conflict after Ysgramor, resulting in the Snow Elves' final expungement from Skyrim's borders, year 139 of the First Era. But to avoid confusion, it would be better to refer to the final battle as the point of no return, the point where the Snow Elves were now set on a path of terminal decline. For starters, Solstheim is covered in ancient ruins of the Dragon Cult before Harold's time, as King Harold was also to have said have cleansed Skyrim of the last of the Dragon Cult at Forelhost, and so that would mean that Miraak's Temple, the Bloodskull Barrow, and so on were all built well before this period, and so the Snow Prince clearly predates this. We also, in the Songs of Return, get a direct allusion to the Battle of the Moesring. Compare the following. From the Fall of the Snow Prince, the Battle of the Moesring was to be the final stand between Nord and Elf on our fair island. Led by Ysgramor, we had driven the Elven Scourge from Skyrim and were intent on cleansing Solstheim of their kind as well. Our warriors, armed with the finest axes and swords Nord craftsmen could forge, cut great swaths through the enemy ranks. The slopes of the Moesring ran red with elf blood. Then, in the Songs of Return, Volume 19, the opening passage appears to be referencing this battle directly. When that final battle at the Barren Pass was completed, and the melting snow carried elf blood back to the sea, the crew of the Calcars, the Sadon Raeth, and the most exalted crew of our Lord's ship, the Ilgamet, at last parted ways, never to join shields again. They drew apart in that form which is not a loss, but a gain in knowing one's heart can be carried in the chests of others. So great was the love that those first of the 500 had for each other, and most especially for the great Ysgramor, harbinger of us all. This also places Ysgramor as a participant in the Battle of the Moesring, meaning the final battle, or rather the point of terminal decline for the Snow Elves, occurred several centuries before the beginning of the First Era. This also makes sense with what Gelebor says.
Unfortunately, we were constantly at war with the Nords, who claimed the land as their ancestral home.
Constant implying some great length of time, rather than a situation where Ysgramor just shows up and deletes all of the Snow Elves. Mind you, he certainly tried his best. Interestingly, with Ysgramor present at the Battle of Moesring, he, with the rest of the Nords, afforded respect to the Snow Prince. I want to highlight this passage from the book Fall of the Snow Prince. And then he fell from his horse, from the battle, from life. The Snow Prince lay dead, slain by a child. With their savior defeated, the spirit of the remaining elven warriors soon shattered. Many fled, and those that remained on the battlefield were soon cut down by our broad Nord axes. When the day was done, all that remained was the carnage of the battlefield, and from that battlefield came a dim reminder of valor and skill, for the brilliant armor and spear of the Snow Prince still shined. Even in death, this mighty and unknown elf filled us with awe. It is common practice to burn the corpses of our fallen foes. This is as much a necessity as it is custom, for death brings with it disease and dread. Our chieftains wished to cleanse Solstheim of the elven horde, in death as well as life. It was decided, however, that such was not to be the fate of the Snow Prince. One so mighty in war, yet so loved by his kin, deserved better, even in death, even if an enemy of our people. And so we brought the body of the Snow Prince, wrapped in fine silks, to a freshly dug barrow. The gleaming armor and spear were presented on a pedestal of honor, and the tomb was arrayed with treasures worthy of royalty. All of the mighty chieftains agreed with this course, that the elf should be so honored. His body would be preserved in the barrow for as long as the earth chose, but would not be offered the protection of our Stalrim, which was reserved for Norddead alone. So ends this account of the Battle of Moesring and the fall of the magnificent elven Snow Prince. May our gods honor him in death, and may we never meet his kind again in life. As indicated by the Songs of Return Volume 19, Ysgramor was present at the Battle of the Moesring, and hence would have also condoned the Snow Prince's honoured burial. I wonder if the Snow Prince's valiant last charge in the face of doom finally cooled Ysgramor's raging heart somewhat, having seen such zeal and fearlessness in the heart of a Snow Elf, forcing him to respect such an enemy. For after this Battle of Moesring, the most exalted crew of the Ylgamet, Ysgramor's ship, parted ways, and Ysgramor returned to the mainland to begin building a new home, to found Windhelm, a city built on the back of Snow Elf captives forced into slavery. Whereas before, Ysgramor could not tolerate the sight of a Snow Elf drawing breath, he could now watch them toil to build his keep. Listen to this passage as they returned from Solstheim. They pressed eastwards, seeking the sea, when they came upon the barrow of Ingol, the mighty Ysgramor's son who had fallen to the whims of kine rather than the treachery of the Elves. Our Lord had not expected to lay eyes upon it again so soon, and his grief flowed anew at the sight of it, as a reopened wound will bleed as it did when first received. His eyes turned to the south, where a river met the sea, and decreed that there would he and the crew of the Ylgamet create a great city, in monument to the glories of mankind, that from his palace he might always look upon the hill of his dear son's resting place, and feel that his line would know peace in this new home that was never known in Atmora. The Elven captives were set to work, bringing forth stone to build in their conqueror's fashion. As many elves died in the building of the city as had the crew of the Ylgamet slain while on the way to its site. And Ysgramor drove the wretches evermore to build higher, to lay a claim to the river so that none might pass into the interior of this land without first showing due respect to its rightful claimant. Thus was the great bridge constructed, forever striding the river that no elf might sneak through to avenge his devious cousins. As the bridge was built long, so too was the palace built high, spires reaching the sky to show dominion even over the very winds that had brought forth such a grief. There are some other important clues for context at this time. Firstly, it is clear that Ysgramor had built certain fortifications, like the bridge, out of concern for elven reprisals, implying that snow elves are still around in places, which of course we know is true, considering the Chantry of Auri-El was built by the snow elves near the beginning of the First Era, which is centuries in the future from this point. But another thing to take note of here is that Skyrim's modern borders aren't established yet, nor is Skyrim as a kingdom. It is King Harald that is considered the first king of Skyrim as we know it today and its modern borders, having relinquished ties with Atmora and cleansing the last of the Snow Elves in the Rift and the Dragon Cult's last holdout at Forelhost. In the passage we just read, it says, "To lay a claim to the river so that none might pass into the interior of this land without first showing due respect to its rightful claimant." I interpret this to mean that at this time, the White River is more or less the border of their currently held lands. Remember, there were only 500 companions initially, and this is the early days of Skyrim's history. After Saarthal was retaken, there were some crews, such as that of the Jorrvaskr, that ventured south into the tundras of modern-day Whiterun. From the Songs of Return, Volume 7, the first to break from the grounded fleet was the crew of the Jorrvaskr, who had been formed of Ysgramor's closest friends. Their captain was known as Jeek of the River, so called by the Harbinger himself from their youths past in glory. When assembling their glistening hull, he sought out the labours of Menro and Manwë, who now bore the native timbers across the new land of Tamriel. "Is not this wide land fit for harvest? Why have not the elves, vile to their core, seen to exploit and tame it?" They asked of their elven captives, for they had many, what they found unfit about these plains. Yet even the captives who still bore their tongues could say nothing of the valley. They looked with fear at the winged colossus, and from their babblings did the warriors of the Jorrvaskr learn that it was older than even the elves themselves. Of those who wrought it solid from its mother stone, nothing could be said, but it was known to drive a magic almost as old as Nirn itself, some remnant of the gods' efforts to render a paradise in Mundus before the shattering of Lorkhan. The first of many, this crew of the Jorrvaskr, heathens and ancestors to us all, feared no stories or gods. Indeed, if there was something the elves feared, they would have it for their own. Thus began the labours, once more, of Menro and Manwë, whose eager hands again laid to the Atmoran wood, which had borne them all across the sea, and what was their ship became their shelter, as this valley became their purview until the end of all their days. Thus began the building of the great city, circled by the running of the White River, as brought forth by these beloved of Ysgramor, yet but 22 of the glorious 500 companions. I do apologize for the excess of Nordic sources, and at times writing this I would worry that it seems to be the greater focus. However, I do feel it necessary context, as there is essentially zero other record of the Snow Elves outside of these Nordic sources. It is very interesting though that these Snow Elves of the region had not made use of the plains of Whiterun for agriculture, nor did they dare approach the Great Bird Monument, which we know as the Skyforge. But the reason I brought this passage to the forefront of our discussion is that it is one of the other established Nordic territories that we know of constructed during Ysgramor's time. I made a map to illustrate what I think the current borders of the Nord territory would have been at this time, that is, at the time of the return, just after the Battle of Moesring and the construction of Windhelm. It seems that the bulk of the 500 companions went east with Ysgramor and carved their way through those lands, and of course took down the Snow Prince in Solstheim, then constructed Windhelm. And we do know that the Snow Elves last known about holdouts during the time of King Harald, in 139 of the First Era, were around Lake Honric in the Rift, so I would imagine that at this time that region was home to many Snow Elves and their settlements, at the time of Ysgramor, though later still within Ysgramor's lifetime, Captain Gorilda Sharktooth and her crew the Fallowfire would establish some ground in the Rift. Saarthal, of course, had also been reclaimed, so overall I imagine in this time the borders of Nordic land would have been something like this, as well as Solstheim, and they continued to press forward, and the dragon cult rose to prominence, and Nordic settlement expanded all across what are now the modern borders. And again, using the Songs of Return as reference, it seems that west of the White River was considered the interior of the Nordic lands. I also threw out some of the yellow spots as markers for the Dwemer holdings that we know of, though their kingdoms were mostly subterranean, and some of these could have been built at dates later than Ysgramor's initial arrival. It's interesting to note that the Snow Elves would have been losing a slow war against the Nords even throughout the Dragon Wars and all that Alduin business. We are about to move forward in the timeline here, but there is one interesting source that I just wanted to throw out there, one that claims that the Snow Elves froze Atmora in a reprisal for the Nordic genocide. The source is a book called The Ship of Ice, a tale told by Winterhold sailors describing an ancient encounter of their grandfathers' grandfathers where a ship came out of the north, reportedly the last to sail from Ilkefik, the main port city of Atmora. "There is no summer in Atmora," the steersman told him. "The day we made ready to sail, a snow elf came to us, a child dressed in a thin gown, though we shivered in our heaviest furs. She said to us, 'I bring you a message. With your swords and axes you slew our homeland. With the frostfall we have now slain yours. Look upon these frozen shores for the last time, and know that this is the harvest that your fathers sowed, and their fathers before them.' Then she vanished. A cold shadow fell upon Kjaland, and all who heard the steersman speak. They looked over the sea toward far Atmora, and indeed the day seemed to grow pale and chill in spite of the summer. Some in Winterhold who were not there later scoffed at the tale. If the Snow Elves commanded such dire magic, they said, then why had they not used it to defeat Ysgramor and save their realms in Skyrim? The steersman and his crew said nothing more, but no more ships came out of Atmora. Now this is just a sailor's tale, and perhaps it's just an example of how the Snow Elves have become a part of the Nordic canon of superstitions and folktales, but it does make you wonder. There too exist superstitions about another kind of creature that you encounter in Skyrim, one that may have a connection to this powerful ice magic and bringer of woe. You may encounter a Wispmother, a rare creature of ghost-like body and terrible magics, but upon closer inspection, you may find that the Wispmother appears almost elven, the ears especially. Researchers are also quite uncertain about the origins of the Wispmother. A book by Matthias Etienne compiles several legends and speculation about the Wispmother. Most tales agree on only a few basic facts about Wispmothers. They are always female. They take the form of human, some say elven, spirits, wreathed in mist and decaying rags. They have an affinity for frost magic, rarely appearing in more temperate climes. But beyond that, the tales differ wildly. Some say they are ghosts waiting to be laid to rest, others that they are the remains of the snow elves who once ruled Skyrim. Some say they are native to Jorrvaskr, or the north more generally, but other tales mention them in forgotten places, on mountaintops as far away as the Jorrvaskr. Most reputable scholars dismiss these stories, preferring instead to focus on the few documented sightings from recent years. From these, two dominant theories have emerged. Based on his extensive research into necromancy and Cyrodiil's Ayleid culture, Master Sadran Sarethi posits that Wispmothers are a necrologic state, a type of lichdom developed by a now forgotten First Era culture. Under his theory, these are no mere ghosts, they are a cult of powerful sorceresses who achieved eternal life through undeath. It is strange to me that one would so quickly dismiss the idea Wispmothers could be related to the Snow Elves, but then cite the idea that they could be a type of lichdom developed by a now forgotten First Era culture, especially considering that the Wispmothers are prevalent in Skyrim, the place where thousands of Snow Elves were killed and pushed to extinction in the late Merethic era and the first centuries of the First Era. After all, Gelebor says that even with the bargain proposed by the Dwemer, some of his brethren refused and sought other methods of survival, hiding out, seeking refuge with other elven races, but perhaps also some delved into the depths of the arcane in order to preserve some semblance of their existence. Perhaps some snow elven sorceresses, lamenting the inevitable fall of their race, instead turned to a form of lichdom or necromantic magic in order to preserve their existence and forever bring woe to their ancient enemies, hence becoming the Wispmothers. Maybe it was this same group of scornful women who brought the freezing of Atmora, and as previously stated in the Ship of Icetail, it was a snow elf girl who brought presage of that land's demise. This is all very loose and speculative, and it's very fun to think about, but moving on. The stage is beyond set for the decline of the Snow Elves, and the next chronological information we have, that is before their degeneration into the Falmer, is that the Chantry of Auri-El is built in what is now called the Forgotten Vale.
The Chantry was constructed near the beginning of the First Era to provide a retreat for those that wish to become enlightened.
At this time, as per the words of Gelebor, there was extant Snow Elf civilization elsewhere in Skyrim, and of course as we move into the First Era, we get to the part where King Harald begins a campaign which eliminates the last remnants within the modern borders of Skyrim. We can deduce that around this period of 1E 130 to 140, that the Snow Elves made the desperate deal with the Dwemer, that which condemned them to a terrible fate. One other remarkable note is that there are near zero archaeological remnants of the Snow Elves outside of the Chantry in the Forgotten Vale, with one tiny example of small ruins below Fallowstone, which implies the total and utter destruction of every single Snow Elf structure in Skyrim. Thunderous voices of the Nords shouting their keeps to dust. I tire of the tears of women and children. My own have run dry. The men have begun to look upon us as if we are all weak, yet we have survived the same trials as they. I cannot bring myself to think on the numbers we lost in battle, yet I cannot force the images of my own losses from my mind. And now, in a time when our people should be banding together, it feels we are drifting apart. The Nords have truly won. Our once great pride and unity are shattered. If we lose hope now, we will never survive. Today, many, myself included, have tried to speak out in voices of reason. There can be no hope without talk of our future. We can make no difference if our spirits remain broken. So ends the tale of the Snow Elves, and so begins the tale of the Falmer, or as Gelebor calls them, the Betrayed. Clearly at this point in time, the Dwemer were expanding their subterranean holds beneath the very feet of the shouting and rampaging Nords, and they made the Snow Elves a deal they could not refuse, or at least those that did witnessed death. We know that the Falmer were intentionally blinded by the Dwemer through the use of a toxin, as per the words of Knight-Paladin Gelebor and the researcher Ursa Wuuthrax, who wrote the book The Falmer, A Study, which provides more elaboration based upon her research of Blackreach. After their defeat by the Nords, the dwarves of old agreed to protect the Falmer, but at a terrible price, for these Dwemer did not trust their Snow Elf guests and forced them to consume the toxic fungi that once grew deep underground. As a result, the Snow Elves were rendered blind. Soon the majestic Snow Elves were rendered powerless. They became the dwarves' servants, and then their slaves. But the Dwemer's treachery was so deep, so complete, that they made the fungi an essential part of the Falmer's diet. This guaranteed the weakness of not only their current Falmer thralls, but their offspring as well. The Snow Elves, for time eternal, would be blind. There are several theories about the specifics, some wilder and more complex, others more simple and perhaps more likely, but there is one important archaeological find that could perhaps shed some light on this issue, as it is one of the only fragments of the Falmer language that remains. Calcemo is an Ultima scholar residing in Markarth. He is a researcher of great renown, specifically famed for his research on the Dwemer, yet it is his translations of Falmer script that are of interest to us. In one of the many excavated rooms of Nuchern-Zel, there is a giant stone tablet eponymously named Calcemo Stone. Calcemo has been researching this stone, trying to translate it and make new discoveries, though we, on the other hand, have the fortune of a translation divined from Kurt Kuhlmann, the co-lead designer on the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, who had been working in different roles at Bethesda since the days of Daggerfall. While technically this translation comes from out of game, I am willing to take this as canon myself, considering he was a lead designer on the very game. Kurt provides the following translation for the writings on the stone. "And so it was that your people were given passage to our steam gardens and the protections of our power. Many of your people had perished under the roaring, snow-throated kings of Mora, and your wills were broken, and we heard you, and sent our machines against your enemies to thereby take you under. Only by the grace of the Dwemer did your culture survive, and only by the 15 and 1 tones did your new lives begin. We do not desire thanks, for we do not believe in it. We do not ask for gratitude, for we do not believe in it. We only request you partake of the symbol of our bond, the fruits of the stones around us. And as your vision clouds, as the darkness sets in, fear not. Know only our mercy and the radiance of our affection, which unbinds your bones to the earth before and sets your final path to the music of your new eternity." So clearly, Calcemo Stone was written by the Dwemer to be read by the Snow Elves. I would likely say at the time of their deal, considering the fact that afterwards the Snow Elves were blinded and were no longer able to read. I'd even speculate that this is a kind of propaganda almost, like I could imagine copies of this exact little speech as an encouraging and commemorative monument for the Snow Elves who were about to undergo or were undergoing the blindness. For many of the Snow Elves, the Dwemer's offer was probably comforting and largely viewed as a benevolent act of friends, even if false. I imagine also that since they didn't literally have their eyes scooped out, the toxic fungi took some time to take complete effect and render the eyes entirely functionless. Weeks, months, perhaps even after a few years of exposure. And this commemorative plaque, this propaganda if you will, would have been comforting to read over and over as their vision slowly fades and the Snow Elves were forced to place their trust in the Dwemer completely. This translated passage also states that the Dwemer actually sent out their machines against the Nords in order to help and protect the remaining Snow Elves. Like I said before, if I was to guess, this was occurring between the years 1E 130 to 140, as the last Snow Elves were said to have been pushed from Skyrim's borders in 1E 139. If the Rift was also one of the last holdouts of the Snow Elves above ground, then that also makes sense in the context of Gelebor's dialogue.
The Chantry is quite isolated, so it took some time for word of the dwarves' offer to reach us here. By the time the compact had been completed, it was too late for us to even attempt to intervene.
This is quite believable with the distance between the Rift and the Forgotten Vale high in the Druidark Mountains. From the passage, it says, "We only request you partake of the symbol of our bond, the fruit of the stones around us, and as your vision clouds, as the darkness sets in, fear not." The fruits of the stones around us certainly refers to the toxic fungi, mushrooms that grow on the walls of the deep caverns that the Dwemer inhabit, that the researcher Ursa Earthrax says rendered them blind, becoming an essential part of their diet, ensuring blindness for generations until it became an endemic feature of their race. Some have taken some poetic phrasing of the following, "And as your vision clouds, as the darkness sets in, fear not. Know only our mercy and the radiance of our affection, which unbinds your bones to the earth before and sets your final path to the music of your new eternity." As evidence for a very fun theory, one that suggests that the Falmer were being used to read the Elder Scrolls, as we know that the Dwemer possessed at least one. Reading the Elder Scrolls themselves eventually renders their readers blind, as is the case with the Moth Priests of Cyrodiil who do so. The Dwemer, or at least a single group of them, remember that the Dwemer were not politically homogenous, Aetherium Wars, Clan Rorken, etc., were researching an Elder Scroll in Skyrim and had complex instruments and tools such as the Great Oculatory and their many lexicons which already serve as a means to decode and transcribe the Elder Scrolls. This theory's idea is that the Dwemer were using the Falmer in experiments to read the Elder Scrolls which rendered them blind. While a fun idea, I do think it unlikely that the Dwemer were using an entire race of Snow Elves and forcing them to read the Elder Scrolls until they went blind. Allow the Snow Elves to have access to the secrets that you have been trying to crack with all of your advanced machinery? I don't think so, especially when you consider the most likely reason for the blinding of the Snow Elves is so that they can't see what the secretive Dwemer are doing, the technology they are developing, so they can't see the writings of the schematics or the secret entrances and then escape and tell enemies. We also only know that the Dwemer had a single Elder Scroll, the very same that you retrieve as part of the main questline in Skyrim. Also, the Elder Scrolls theory provides no explanation as to why successive generations developed blindness as opposed to the toxic fungi being forced upon them as part of their continued diet, allowing some form of evolutionary redundancy, in the case of eyes, to take place, along with, as we are forced to speculate, evolutionary adaptations, in the case of hearing and smell, in order to compensate. While this is a novel theory, I believe it's pure eisegesis, that is, starting with an idea and reading into the text, rather than extrapolating from the text as is. Wacky theories aside, it is clear that the Dwemer took some degree of self-satisfaction in their role as benevolent saviors of the Snow Elves, and considering what happens next, it would appear that they didn't mind having able bodies around for slavery, or perhaps even experiments. The transition wouldn't have been immediate, of course. As the book by Ursa Earthrak says, they became the dwarves' servants, and then their slaves. But the Dwemer's treachery was so deep, so complete, that they made the fungi an essential part of the Falmer's diet. This guaranteed the weakness of not only their current Falmer thralls, but their offspring as well. The Snow Elves, for time eternal, would be blind. Those first few decades, the first few generations, for a few centuries perhaps, you would imagine that the Snow Elves appeared as Gelebor does, but simply blind. And in time, successive generations were born with progressively worse initial eyesight, which then, as per their diet of toxic fungi, blinded them early in life until the eyes of successive generations no longer grew, leaving them with vestigial eye sockets of closed-over flesh. Of course, this is a world of magic, so we can't expect a complete one-to-one with evolutionary processes, but we could speculate a little. The Dwemer could have been employing all kinds of experiments against their servants, then slaves. It is possible that some of their evolutionary changes occurred with the assistance of other alchemical interventions, perhaps even the corruption of their souls. I've got an idea, a little bit of conjecture to ponder. You'll want to take the following into consideration. In the Elder Scrolls lore, there is always going to be a discrepancy between in-game representations and how something functions in a lore sense. So, one of the easiest examples to cite is that there aren't literally 74 people in Whiterun. In the game, this is true, but the game is a representation of an underlying reality in which the cities of Tamriel would have sizes and populations far larger. The same goes for the idea that the Dragonborn can down 42 potions in less than half a second. In a lore sense, this is not true, merely a function of the game, a practicality. Personally, I think the whole science of soul gems falls into this category somewhat. The harsh distinctions between petty, lesser, common, greater, and grand souls are largely gameplay distinctions, as each corresponding size of soul gives a certain level of recharge for enchanted weapons or magnitude for new enchantments. Such rigid distinctions, I believe, largely exist for gameplay reasons, and they must take balancing into account. So I say all this to establish that in the gameplay of Skyrim, Falmer do not have black souls as other mortal races, which means their souls can only be captured in black soul gems. Rather, they have white souls of varying sizes, like other creatures of Tamriel: petty, lesser, common, greater, and grand. Even within the lore, as per the writings of Vanus Galerian, the founder of the Mages Guild, there is a reasoning given to the distinctions. Furthermore, I propose that for the purposes of soul trapping, we categorize all souls into two classes: the legal, or white souls, those smaller essences that are captured from beasts and animals, and illegal, or black souls, which are derived from sentient mortals, and we will teach only those spells that can capture white souls, forbidding our students to use the larger soul gems on sentients. So according to Vanus Galerian, Aetherium, the distinction between black and white souls is largely based upon the legality of their capture. But of course, in gameplay within Skyrim, the game doesn't allow you to illegally capture a High Elf soul, for example, within a white Grand Soul Gem. Gets a little messy in this territory, but the reason I bring this whole tangent up is that presumably, like all other mortals, the Snow Elves would have had Grand Souls, black souls if you will, that can only be captured in black soul gems as per the gameplay of Skyrim. Well, the degenerated Falmer of the current day possess white souls of greater and lesser strength, depending on the particular strength of the enemy. For example, a Falmer Warmonger has a white Grand Soul, but a Falmer Skulker has a lesser soul, or a Falmer Shadowmaster can have a common or Grand Soul depending on their level. This intuitively feels like a gameplay-based decision, especially since the exact same kind of Falmer rank can have varied soul sizes depending on level. However, to extrapolate something of interest from all of this, what we can say for certain is that there is some level of soul degradation amongst the Falmer. You will find no Altmor or no Nord with a soul of less strength than a Grand Soul, but amongst the Falmer it is commonly found. Relating this to what started this tangent, it could be possible that the Dwemer were experimenting on the Snow Elves and manipulating their souls, perhaps siphoning power from them to power their automatons. That is something we also must consider, that soul gems appear on all the Dwemer automatons of Skyrim, that someone or something's soul energy had to be put into in order to enchant or give sentience to them. While steam power may explain the raw function of its body, the soul gems or essence within them are likely what gives them a kind of sentience, allowing them to be programmed perhaps. None of this is definitive, but it would explain an additional purpose for the Falmer thralls. Imagine that the Dwemer had an entire race of elves from which they can siphon soul energy from, perhaps damaging the Falmer's souls in the process, explaining why their souls have degenerated, and then used that power to create the limited sentience of their automatons. This is largely guesswork, but I do like that it explains two phenomena, both the degraded states of the Falmer souls and also the source of the souls within the soul gems of all the Dwemer automatons. Even if it was not the case that the Dwemer were siphoning soul energy for their automatons, they could have been straight up keeping the Falmer as slaves to breed and be soul trapped to provide a steady supply of souls for their creations. Theories aside for the moment, we know what the Falmer look like today, but it must have been a long process.
The blinding of my race was supposedly accomplished with a toxin, certainly not enough to devolve them into the sad and twisted beings they've become.
With this taken into consideration, when we speak of the War of the Crag, we must envision some kind of in-between stage. The War of the Crag was the inevitable conflict between the Falmer and the Dwemer, no doubt a reprisal for their treatment, their blinding, their betrayal, perhaps even for their treatment as experiments. From the writings of Ursa Earthrax, but as is always the story with slaves and their masters, the Falmer eventually rebelled. Generations after they first sought solace amongst the dwarves and experienced bitter betrayal, the Falmer rose up against their oppressors. They overthrew the dwarves and fled even further down, into Blackreach's deepest, most hidden reaches. For decade upon decade, the two sides waged a bitter conflict, a full-fledged and bloody War of the Crag that raged deep below Skyrim's surface, completely unbeknownst to the Nords above, a war whose battles and heroes must forever remain lost to our knowledge. Until one day the war ended, for on that day the Falmer went to meet their Dwemer foes in battle, only to find that the entire race had vanished. This War of the Crag, given that the war ended as the Dwemer vanished, occurred in the decades preceding year 700 of the First Era, which is the date of the Battle of Red Mountain, in which the entire race of the Dwemer disappeared from Nirn. The source says for decade upon decade that the Falmer and Dwemer fought underground, and since it did not say century, I'd be willing to say that the War of the Crag lasted for less than that, but more than a few decades. Anywhere between 30 and 90 years of the 7th century of the First Era seems like a reasonable length for the prolonged conflict, but I'll provide some additional context, even if elusive. The Falmer at this point had been blinded and underground with the Dwemer for over 500 years. Their devolution was certainly underway at this point. However, it may seem strange to you that they would even be in the position to rebel at all. Well, for starters, they must have at least had the beginnings of enhanced senses like echolocation and improved sense of smell to even stand a chance. And let us not forget that among those attuned to the arcane, as many of them are, spells like Detect Life or their variations could also help to compensate for blindness. But regardless regardless of their individual merits, the Dwemer were experiencing troubles from other fronts. The exactness of the political landscapes of over 4,000 years ago are difficult to determine, but the book The Aetherium Wars provides a little context in which the great dwarven cities from Markarth to the Velothi Mountains fell before the armies of High King Gelebor. In the years following King Harald's reign, the Dwemer discovered a considerable source of Aetherium in their deepest delvings. An alliance of 4 cities led by Archanthames, the great research centre in the Southern Reach, was formed to oversee its extraction, processing and study, and a new Aetherium forge constructed to smelt it under precisely controlled conditions. If the inscriptions I discovered are to be believed, the results were nothing short of spectacular. The items produced by the forge were artifacts of immense power, imbued from the moment of their creation with powerful enchantments. The Dwarven alliance shattered almost immediately as the 4 city-states and their rivals attempted to claim the forge. We can only speculate that none were successful. Decades of conflict merely weakened them all, allowing for King Gelir's subsequent conquests, and though the Dwemer reclaimed most of their lands a century later, there is no evidence that they ever resumed their research on Aetherium. Perhaps the costs had just been too great. The expansion of Nordic power under King Vrage, one of King Harald's successors, would have caused great disruption throughout the soon-to-be-claimed Nordic lands of Morrowind and of course within Skyrim, and then it would appear that the infighting of the Aetherium Wars weakened them and allowed their city-states to collapse. As the book says, cities that had held fast against the Nords for over 100 years crumbled abruptly and without warning. For centuries, scholars have marveled at the sudden collapse of the Dwemer city-states. We don't have precise dates, but the reign of King Harald ended year 221 of the First Era, followed by the tiny reign of King Hjalmar in 1E 221 to 222, and then King Vrage the Gifted's reign beginning in 1E 222. Vrage was wildly successful, and during his reign, Morrowind and High Rock were swallowed by his empire. King Gelor, who was named responsible for the conquest of the Dwemer city-states in Skyrim, according to the book, occurred after Harald's reign, which means after Vrage, which means sometime between the end of Vrage's reign, which we don't have a date for, and before King Borgus's reign, which ended 369. He is also the only other king we know about from this period of Skyrim's earliest history. All this is to say that the Dwemer of Skyrim experienced intense destabilization at this time in history due to the infighting between the city-states, their destruction, and then, as the book Aetherium Wars says, they reclaimed most of their land a century later. So within the 500 or so year period between the Snow Elves' blinding and the War of the Crag, there would have been ample opportunities for the subterranean Falmer to break free and form underground refuges, especially during the destruction of the Dwemer city-states at the hands of the Nords. Even though the book says that they were reclaimed, we do not know to what extent, and it's possible that the Falmer were able to secure sections of underground cities or escape into certain abandoned tunnel systems and form successive rebellions over the years. Anyways, the Dwemer vanish from the world year 1E 700, and suddenly the Falmer, who had for centuries been dominated by the Dwemer, were free, without enemy, entirely by themselves, in these vast subterranean complexes that are the Dwemer cities. This is where we experience a near complete absence of information. Describing the Falmer experience for thousands of years since the Dwemer disappearance can only be an experiment of conjecture. The writings of Ursa Earthrax have this to say on the topic. Finally free from the threat of the Dwemer overlords, the Falmer were able to spread freely throughout Blackreach, but years of fighting the dwarves had left them bloodthirsty and brutal. Feeling the need to conquer, to kill, they began mounting raids to the surface world. And so the legends began, of small, blind, goblin-like creatures who would rise from the cracks of the earth in the dead of night to slaughter cattle, attack lonely travelers, and steal sleeping babes from their cribs. In recent years, however, the sightings of these creatures have become more and more frequent, their raids more organized, their attacks more brutal. In fact, one might even come to the conclusion that the Falmer are ready to change once again. Could it be true? Are the Snow Elves of ages past ready to reclaim their long-forgotten glory? Are they ready to surge to the surface and make war upon the Light Dwellers? If that happens, if the Falmer are indeed planning on reconquering Skyrim, I fear a horror neither man nor gods could possibly stand against. I do believe Ursa here gets a little carried away, but sightings and raids have become more frequent, and you can find several examples in the game, such as the slaughter at Lai's retreat in the Reach. For thousands of years, these creatures could be rendered to the fancies of superstitious Nords, but now to deny their existence seems entirely dismissive of reality. This is a very long video, which I hope you've been enjoying, and I'm afraid it's about to get a bit longer because now we are able to properly enter the analysis of their contemporary culture, lifestyle, and perhaps we can try and piece together some evidence for their religion and contrast it to what we know of their old one. The Falmer, as they are today, are the chitin-clad troglodytes of the dark depths of Skyrim. Bogles, claddercoats, fish people. They are known to have a repulsive odor, a distinct signal for dungeon delvers to be on their guard. They dwell in camps of tribes or clans spread all throughout subterranean Skyrim, their tents, totems and fences made of chitinous creatures most resembling the insectoid Chaurus, of which they are so seemingly dependent on for both food, Chaurus meat and Chaurus eggs, and chitin for armor, weapons and architecture. But too, there are examples of other, albeit similar, insect creatures, as can be seen in this example of a tent, in which some scorpion Chaurus-like creature has been used in its construction. Interestingly, there was Skyrim concept art piece of a Falmer riding a Chaurus-like creature as a war mount. We also see clear examples of domesticated Chaurus as both war companions and in pens, presumably for egg production or meat. But we also find examples of domesticated frostbite spiders as their companions, which is quite interesting. Clearly, the strange insectoid creatures of Skyrim's depth have been essential in the development of their culture, both on a more practical level, husbandry, armor, tents, etc., but also on an ornamental level. Their staves are made of Chaurus pincers, and their chitinous parts are used in the construction of armor, totems, circlets, and so on. Religion often determines the fundamental layers of a culture's values and sensibilities, and so we should home in on that for a moment. Falmer society, in gameplay terminology at least, have several ranks which imply a warlike and raiding culture, which also supports the more recent aggression towards the surface that we have seen. Names such as Skulker, Gloom Lurker, Night Prowler, Shadowmaster, and Warmonger. But too, we have the Falmer shamans, who for the most part are powerful magic users and female. There are many facets of modern-day Falmer culture that seem to echo a pagan-like tribal society. I think it is fair to presume that these Falmer shamans take on the role of spiritual leaders amongst their tribes or clans, and too, we find several examples of surface-dweller bones of the slain used in the construction of totems and shrines, which could imply the Falmer perform human sacrifice, or rather use trophies of war in their religious constructions. Too, there is Skyrim concept art that shows Falmer characters with kidnapped human babies. Perhaps there has always been truth to the idea that the Falmer kidnap surface dwellers and bring them down to their subterranean lairs for sacrifice. But that begs the question, sacrifice to what or whom? Blood sacrifice is not a part of Aedric faiths, and certainly not of their ancient religion, as per the words of Gelebor.
Auri-El, Auri-El, Alkosh, Akatosh, so many different names for the sovereign of the Snow Elves. Our empire had temples to some of the other deities. Trinimac, Sirabane, Y'ffre, and Finister rounded out the rest, but those temples paled in comparison to the glory of the Chantry and its way shrines.
It is clear that the Snow Elves shared a similar faith to that of the other Altmora-derived Elven groups, but it does have a distinct flavour. Auri-El for the Snow Elves is most clearly personified by the sun, as after all, the sun is the largest aperture with which we can see the glory of Aetherius wherein the gods reside. To quote the book Touching the Sky, which is an overview of Snow Elf pilgrimages to the Chantry of Auri-El, many of the most dedicated Snow Elves once committed themselves to a tireless journey through the Chantry to the inner sanctum. They carried with them the paramount desire to become one with their god, Auri-El. Though all set out with the determination to prove their worth, few were prepared for the trials that lay ahead, for the path to Auri-El was not without its tribulations. The pilgrims struggled not only against the natural elements of the treacherous vale, but with a myriad of tests upon their faith and loyalty. Auri-El, as we have discussed earlier in the video, is also called King of the Altmora, and I do find it interesting that we have no records of a Snow King, but we do of a Snow Prince. I have a little theory that the Snow Prince, as it seems, is actually functionally the supreme ruler of the Snow Elves, for the title of King is reserved for Auri-El alone, the true king of their people. Consider also that if we take the previously stated idea that the Falmer are the remnants of the ancient kingdom of Altmora, then Auri-El would have been on Nirn at this time, fighting with them against the armies of Lorkhan, and hence why they refused to name a king on Nirn, only a prince. This could be false, and the kings of the Snow Elves are just without record, but I think it's an entertaining idea. The Snow Elves seem to be quite a religious people, though I suppose this is not uncommon, but I do wonder if their people were in some sense far more theocratic than their other elven counterparts.
I was the arch-curate of Auri-El, girl. I had the ears of a god.
Just a little fun thing to think about. News has reached us that the great Snow Prince has fallen in battle. The urgency to go into hiding has left many of us scattered, and those of us still together unsure of which direction to turn. In the long hours of night, we keep huddled together, always fearing the worst, until the first light of the blessed sun. May Auri-El guide our footsteps. Anyways, the key point is that the Snow Elves were clearly most invested in Auri-El as the paramount of their religious faith, and this provides context for how devastating their exile to the subterranean realms of the Dwemer would have been. The Snow Elves were removed from the sight of Auri-El. No longer could they gaze at the sun and feel the warmth of the heavens beyond grace their skin and have his splendor fill their hearts. They were blinded. Never again could the Falmer witness the glory of the firmament. Now, with that understanding, I have to say that I find it highly unlikely the Falmer of today would worship Auri-El. I would even go as far to say that I don't even think they could understand him conceptually. The light of Auri-El means nothing to them. For millennia, they have been without the concept of what light is. A very on-the-nose candidate for potential worship among the Falmer could be the Daedric prince Namira, whose sphere is ancient darkness, a patron of shadowy spirits and the manifestation of mortal revulsion. She is often associated with insects, slugs, and spiders, and we discussed Chorus and spiders have been domesticated by the Falmer, perhaps through methods taught by Namira. I would not be surprised if other slugs and bugs make up part of the Falmer diet alongside fungi. Consider also the Falmer are said to smell terrible, inspiring revulsion in adventurers who encounter them, and 2 human sacrifice for the Daedric princes is common enough, and I would not think these Falmer are sacrificing to an Aedra. Then again, their culture could have distorted and warped to the point where they feel it necessary. The rankings of the Falmer also thematically fit with names like Gloomlurker and Shadowmaster, but these are largely all thematic connections. I would certainly place Namira as a likely candidate, especially because her powers and blessings would certainly befit a race of blinded cave-dwelling savages, helping them thrive in the darkness, though there are examples of some shrines that look similar to Hermaeus Mora in iconography, specifically the position of the pincered claws, but this could also be happenstance. After all, when all you can do is build with pieces of insects and bone, you may find that you accidentally replicate a shrine or two which appear similar to the grotesque amalgamation of pincers and tentacles with which Hermaeus Mora is often depicted. Personally, I don't think there is too much about Falmer society that would indicate a particular reference of Hermaeus Mora, but again, culture is multifaceted, and there is no reason he could not be worshipped in conjunction. Perhaps he is a patron of the shamans, who from Hermaeus Mora attain knowledge of their past glories, and through which they are perhaps inspired to galvanize the Falmer against the surface dwellers, leading to more frequent raids on the above. We can see, as per the Falmer inhabitation of the canyons in the Forgotten Vale, that the Falmer are not opposed to living on the surface when it is possible. Another potential, though really loose idea, is that a god they worship is not known by surface dwellers. Insects are obviously on theme here, and there is one source called the Adabal-Ar, a recount of the Elysian Rebellion and the fight against the Ayleids. This rebellion was occurring just over 100 years since King Harold removed the last of the Snow Elves from Skyrim, and hence the deal with the Dwemer had been accepted. The source is listing tribes of Needs, and then we get to the Men of Gi, who were eventually destroyed when the Flower King Nillikai made great sacrifice to an insect god named Lost. Here we have an example of a great sacrifice being made to an insect god, which could possibly be a Daedra or other god we are familiar with but under another guise, or perhaps, as Michael Kirkbride, who wrote this lore for Oblivion, suggests, I wonder if there are gods and demons that don't fit within the established pantheons. Maybe the Falmer came upon this insect god in the darkness of their new eternity. Human sacrifices, insect dependency, and iconography, this all feels very loose and rooted in thematic connections only. Perhaps this insect god was called Xrib. Yes, we're going to discuss Xrib, the Xrib. Who is Xrib, you may ask? Well, no one really knows for certain, and I suppose that's the fun of it. A while back we made a video all about this topic, so I may keep it a contained discussion here, and then you could go and look at that video for yourself. But since we're talking about the Falmer and their religion, we should certainly have a little look to see into this mysterious Xrib. So firstly, where does the name come from? It's not actually uttered a single time in-game, nor is it in any written sources. The name comes from a location in the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, the Temple of Xrib. Through a location called the Sightless Pit, you can venture into the hidden Dwemer ruins of below and discover the location called the Temple of Xrib. The evidence for this being a temple of Falmer, beside it being inhabited by Falmer, is primarily the Skyrim official Prima Game Guide, a guide made in conjunction with Bethesda for the release of Skyrim in 2011. And it says this about the Sightless Pit. Drop into this dark hole if you dare. You'll find a large, frozen cave which leads to a rare Falmer temple. The altar above the Sightless Pit is also by the game guide called the Altar of Xrib, and here we see a sacrifice upon it, or at least a skeleton. It could be unrelated. These structures are clearly Dwemer, but obviously have been retrofitted for religious use by the Falmer, given the bones and offerings within the temple. Speculation abounds as to who Xrib is, and we won't have a definitive answer for you, but the shrine does not seem reminiscent of the other totems that we see around amongst the Falmer, and so perhaps it is only this particular group of Falmer in the Sightless Pit who so worship the mysterious Xrib. I'd argue that the phrase rare Falmer temple implies that this is the case. There are also several possibilities for the true identity of this Xrib, but one of my favorites is one that posits Xrib as a corrupted form of Xarxes. Xarxes is a traditional Aldmeri god, the scribe of Auri-El, and given the other similarities between the Snow Elves pantheon and other Altmora-derived groups, then it would be a reasonable assertion that Xarxes played a part in their religion. You'd probably think, wait, what if this is a Dwemer name? This seems unlikely, as in every single place name or individual name of the Dwemer we don't find a single letter X. Interesting, huh? Xarxes is often associated with memory, the recorder of ancestry, and the one who watches. It is possible that during the fall of the Snow Elves, Xarxes had greater importance as a deity to remember them and their past glories, and as they degenerated into their form and their past became mysterious to even them, Xarxes became Xrib, a deformed Falmer version of Xarxes developed over thousands of years. Another fun thing to point out is that the name Xrib could be a contraction of Xarxes and scribe, which was his role, so over time, as they were oppressed by their Dwemer overlords, perhaps their worship of the scribe of Auri-El, named Xarxes, became that of Xrib, the Falmer god of memory. I implore you to check out the video linked below for a more thorough explanation of this mysterious Xrib, but it's also worth noting here that one of the only depictions of a snow elf discoverable outside of Gelebor and his brother, who still live, is the statue deep within the Dwemer ruin of Erkenthand. This could be a snow elf sage kind of character, or it could perhaps be a statue of a snow elf depiction of Xarxes sitting cross-legged with a book and a staff and a torch, which I suppose is thematically similar to other Aldmeri-derived cultures' depictions of Xarxes holding a book. Xarxes is described as the one who watches, and the enormous precious gems that once sat as the statue's eyes before being stolen could have been a representation of his godly eyes who witness all. I will say Xarxes also has connections with Hermaeus Mora, who himself claims to have stored his knowledge within the Ogma Infinium.
You have served me well, and I am pleased. I give you this, the Ogma Infinium. Knowledge given by me to Xarxes is recorded within.
Perhaps this lends extra credence to the potential idea of Hermaeus Mora worship found amongst other Falmer, as we previously discussed with some of their totems looking eerily similar to other depictions of Hermaeus Mora in statues. At the end of the day, all of this is heavy speculation, and Xrib could be an entirely unique entity, perhaps connected to some force of the deep, like the mysterious deep ones of Hackdirt, or the insect god of the Ayleid flower king Nillikai. Again, check out the Xrib video for more, linked below. So we have travelled time from the potential origins of the Snow Elves as remnants of the ancient, perhaps mythical kingdom of Altmora, through to their inhabitation of Skyrim, throughout the Merethic era, until their demise at the arrival of the Nords, and through to their devastating decline into the degenerated Falmer via their compact with the Dwemer. So what now? Savage raiders? Goblin-like tribes for eternity? Well, clearly there has been an increase in their number, the frequency of their raids, development of their culture and crafting. We can look even to their rather impressive, almost town-sized settlement built in the canyons of the Forgotten Vale. Throughout the course of the Dawnguard DLC, you will come to the discovery that the Archcurate Vyther had become a vampire.
Deep inside, it brings me joy that the betrayed weren't to blame for what happened here, because that means there's still hope that they might one day shed their hatred and learn to believe in Auri-El once again. I feel nothing but sympathy for the betrayed, despite my actions against them. But I'm afraid that they're well beyond a cure at this point. The twisted forms you've seen didn't occur overnight. It isn't a plague or a disease that ravaged our species. The dwarves may have stolen their sight, but it took many generations for them to become what they are today. Perhaps they'll never return to their former appearance. But over the centuries, I've noticed a rise in their intellect. If a line of communication could be established with them, maybe they can find peace. It's the only way they'll discover that they weren't always malignant. They were once a proud and prosperous race.
I highly doubt that the Elder Scrolls 6 A would take place in Skyrim and B take place far enough in the future for any meaningful change to occur within the Falmer, but it's interesting to hear Gelebor's thoughts about a potential reconciliation with their past glories. The Falmer are one of the most unique races on Tamriel, not only in that their forms have been drastically changed, warped by mutation, but also in the way that their histories are so vague and mysterious. Hardly any architectural evidence of their past glories remain, unlike the Dwemer, for instance, whose great ruins are spread right across the north of Tamriel. I'd love to hear your contributions and thoughts in the comments below. My name is Scott from Fudge Muppet. Thank you for watching the video. I hope you thoroughly enjoyed. Give us a like. Thanks again, and I'll be back to nerd out with you next time.